Afternoon, everyone. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 116 of House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations, also known as the Mighty Ogo, pursuant to Standing Order 108.3C and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, February 14th, 2024. Committee is meeting to consider matters related to federal regulatory modernization initiatives. Reminder, please do not put your earpieces near the microphone as it causes feedback to our very valued interpreters. We have 4 opening statements. We'll just start from Mr. Greer. We'll go my left to your right. But before we do, I just want to make a small comment. It's 25th anniversary of my wedding today, so I want to give a shout out to my wife for putting up with me for 25 years. And I will note that I granted her wedding request, or gift request, which was to be away from her in Ottawa today. So happy anniversary to my lovely wife, Sasha. Yeah, and maybe we won't get to 26. Yes. Yes. We'll start, Mr. Greer, 5-minute opening statement. I please ask, because we have got so many opening statements, keep it to no further than 5 minutes, because I don't want to have to cut you off. Thanks very much. Please go ahead, Mr. Greer.
Perfect. Well, thank you for having me here today on behalf of the Canadian manufacturers and exporters. Manufacturing generates 10% of Canada's GDP, produces nearly 2/3 of Canada's value-added exports, employing 1.8 billion people in high-paying jobs across the country. It doesn't take more than a cursory look at Canada's key economic indicators to see that we are in a growth crisis. Just 2 weeks ago, the senior deputy governor of the Bank of Canada called Canada's lagging productivity an emergency. CME is pleased to participate in your study and share our thoughts on part of what is contributing to our economic malaise, Canada's regulatory competitiveness. Canada is an increasingly challenging jurisdiction to start, invest in, and grow a manufacturing business. Canadian manufacturers are caught up in an increasingly complex web of rules and requirements that prevent businesses and their employees from reaching their full potential. When we survey our members, a large majority of whom are small and medium-sized manufacturers, regulatory burden consistently polls as one of the biggest barriers to growing their business. Over the last 2 decades, the federal government has undertaken a range of regulatory red tape reduction initiatives and reforms. They have all been useful to varying degrees, but fall well short of what is required to reduce the ongoing accumulation of red tape, removing the dynamism from our economy. This assessment applies to the current federal regulatory modernization agenda underway by Treasury Board. While it has some worthwhile tools, it is too modest in its scope and its ambition. With that in mind, I'd like to share some of CME's recommendations on how the government should make Canada more competitive. First, we recommend that the government legislate economic growth and competitiveness mandates for all regulators alongside their current mandates. Presently, many regulators do not sufficiently consider the economic consequences of their actions because they are not required to. We can achieve both protection and prosperity, but only if the government sets an expectation that economic growth is an outcome that all regulators should be working towards. In the 2018 Fall Economic Statement, the government announced that it was considering implementing a change to add regulatory efficiency and economic growth to regulator mandates. However, after 2 rounds of consultations in 2019, it was quietly abandoned. This change could be modeled after the UK Growth Duty, implemented there in 2017, which provides detailed guidance for UK regulators on how they can better support sustainable economic growth through the decisions that they make and the ways in which they regulate. We believe this is the most important policy change that this committee could recommend and that the government could undertake. There are other steps the government should take to reduce the cumulative burden facing manufacturers and all businesses. We believe the government should expand the scope and ambition of the one-for-one rule. As committee members here will know, this rule requires that every new regulation that increases the administrative burden on business, that the cost of this burden must be offset through other regulatory challenges. Despite this rule being in place for well over a decade, the number of overall administrative requirements on business has continued to increase from 129,000 when the federal government first started tracking this figure in 2014 to 149,000 as of mid-2022. That's a net increase of nearly 20,000 new administrative requirements over 8 years. We also think there's an important leadership role for the federal government to work with the provinces to undertake a serious effort to reduce interprovincial trade barriers and promote regulatory harmonization between provinces through mutual recognition. Most of Canada's interprovincial trade barriers are the costs of complying with rules, regulations, standards, and certifications that vary from one province to another. Mutual recognition would provide that for any one province should allow any product, service, credential, or other certification to be considered automatically compliant if it is already compliant in another jurisdiction. The 2017 Canada Free Trade Agreement did create a body, the Regulatory Reconciliation and Cooperation Table, to resolve interprovincial regulatory differences. However, it has proven to be not fit for purpose. While it has done some valuable work, simply does far too little, far too slowly. Lastly, and while perhaps not as transformative, we do believe there are small but meaningful steps that the government can take to strengthen some of the regulatory modernization tools already at their disposal. For instance, the External Advisory Committee on Regulatory Competitiveness, first established in 2018, provides advice to the President of the Treasury Board on how to improve Canada's regulatory competitiveness. It has made a series of excellent recommendations to the government, including in its most recent letter, which stated, and I quote, "What we have heard from all is that there is an urgent need to address the challenges that face the regulatory system. We recommend that Treasury Board adopt a comply or explain principle to the committee's advice, which means that the government is obliged to either pursue the proposed initiatives from the committee or explain why they will not be pursued. This comply or explain principle would add a level of accountability to the work and other government consultation panels." To wrap up, the ability to navigate complex regulatory processes should not be a primary driver of business success in Canada. However, it has become so, and in the face of the current growth crisis, essential that governments invest more of their time and energy to help make Canada a lower friction economy. Doing so will help create a more efficient and competitive industrial economy while increasing the wealth and well-being of Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Greer. Ms. Pullman, welcome back. Please go ahead for 5.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. As you may know, the CFIB is a not-for-profit organization representing the interests of over 97,000 small and medium-sized businesses across Canada. Our members come from all sectors of the economy in all regions of Canada. It's important to distinguish between regulations that are justified and excessive regulations, which we know as red tape. Many regulations are integral and needed in our system, such as those that protect the health and safety of Canadians. On the other hand, red tape is excessive government regulations that are unfair, overly costly, poorly designed, or contradictory. It can also include unnecessary delays and poor government customer service. It undermines productivity, lowers wages, and harms the entrepreneurial spirit. CFIB first estimated the cost of regulation to Canadian businesses in 2005. Our most recent measure from 2020 found that the total cost of regulation on businesses from all levels of government was $38.8 billion. Of this, businesses identified 28%, or $10.8 billion of that, as excessive regulatory burden. More importantly, the regulatory burden hits small businesses the hardest. The cost of government regulation for businesses with fewer than 5 employees were 5 times higher than the cost for businesses with 100 or more employees. This is because larger businesses can spread the regulatory burden across a greater number of employees and often have in-house resources devoted to compliance. Beyond the burden of time and money, excessive regulations creates frustration. It might take 2 hours to understand confusing language on a form and get an answer from a government helpline, and then another 2 hours for your blood pressure to come down. So it's no surprise that 87% of small business owners say excessive regulations add significant stress to their lives, and 63% would not advise their children to start a business given the current burden of regulations in Canada. Further, 81% agree that excessive government regulations reduces their business's productivity and ability to grow. If regulatory costs on their businesses were reduced, small businesses would use that extra time and money to increase wages, invest in new equipment, and dedicate more time to employee training, all of which are key to growing productivity. We have identified a number of specific examples of excessive regulations at the federal level that need attention, including things like the disability tax credit forms, T4 dental care and UHT reporting, CBSA classifications, airline fitness to travel forms, interprovincial trade barriers like the movement of food across borders, and many more. And I'm happy to elaborate on any of those if needed. Now, we can try and fix every specific regulatory issue that arises, but this will never fix the overall regulatory burden. So a broader approach is also needed. Over the years, we have learned that there are 3 essential ingredients to effective regulatory modernization. They are: 1, political leadership. Effective and sustained regulatory reform must be driven from the top, with a political commitment from the leadership that is echoed through all the departments and agencies. 2nd, regulatory accountability. Regulation deserves the same level of transparency and debate as taxing and spending. Real regulatory accountability requires ongoing measurement and external oversight. To do this, governments need to look at the regulatory burden found not only in regulations, but also in legislation, policies, and forms. Additionally, government should measure that burden from all government departments, agencies, and delegated authorities to obtain a comprehensive measure and then publicly report on that measure on a regular basis. The third is constraints on regulators. Perhaps the most effective element to achieving regulatory modernization is imposing constraints on the regulators themselves. Implementing a cap on regulatory costs can ensure that the burden of regulations is kept in check. And it also forces regulators to consider alternatives and trade-offs and to prioritize those regulations that are most important. A regulatory cap could take the form of a reduction target or a target for no net increase in regulatory activity. Now, the current federal one-for-one rule, where one regulation of equal burden must be eliminated for every new one introduced, is a good example of this. However, the federal approach is too narrow and too complicated. We would also suggest government continue to work on a few other regulatory modernization best practices. They include things like make plain language a priority. It's reasonable to expect governments to provide consistent, timely advice in plain language. Introduce a virtual suggestion box, which would allow citizens to flag red tape examples for government. Next, keep compliance flexible and provide basic guidelines for what constitutes compliance. Regulations really work best when they are outcome-based rather than prescriptive. This allows businesses to find the most cost-effective way to comply with the rules. However, smaller businesses do not typically have the resources to explore different options for the least costly way to comply. So those businesses having basic guidelines regarding what constitutes compliance is extremely important. Fourth, improve online options. Being able to do things online can save a lot of time, but it's also important that online options provide clear pathways to deal with a live person when needed. And finally, improve the accountability of regulators by instituting measures like reverse onus guidelines. Often there's little or no flexibility for business owners when it comes to meeting their compliance obligations. However, regulators usually have no specific timelines imposed on them for when decisions will be made or paperwork will be approved. These imbalances should be remedied so regulators also have deadlines and suffer consequences when deadlines are not met or if advice proves inaccurate or inconsistent. Thanks for the opportunity, and I'd like to share our thoughts, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Swans, am I pronouncing that right?
You got it right. Thank you. iCanada serves businesses who depend on the movement of goods across Canada's international borders. We have over 85 years of experience bringing industry and government together for collaborative decision-making. I'm joined by Keith Musser, the VP of Regulatory Affairs at iCanada and a member of Treasury Board's External Advisory Council on Regulatory Competitiveness. A decade ago, I was starting a new role. The VP came out of his office and said something along the lines of, per my note, let's go decide on our annual goals. The whole team went into the boardroom. He dismissed the first person, and after the second person spoke, the visibly uncomfortable VP stood up, announced the annual targets, and abruptly ended the meeting. The conclusion was decided before the beginning. Here's the deal. His team had loftier goals than the plan to accomplish them. He could have looked like a hero, but he simply refused to listen. Many consultations executed by the Government of Canada have the same outcome. The structure of the consultation is perfectly manipulated to ensure the feedback it receives is exactly what it wants to hear. In social media, we call this an echo chamber. We only follow accounts that reconfirm our biases each and every day. We will never get to a modernized regulatory environment without engaging the regulated party. On the American television drama The West Wing, C.J. Craig, the press secretary, often laments about Take Out the Trash Friday, where unfavorable stories are dumped. She fears the administration has become too skilled. We notice that there is a substantial spike in formal consultations around December, July, and August, perhaps a similar phenomenon. How does an ineffective regulation enter into force? It was dumped in the summer, presented to like-minded special interest groups for their echo of approval, and presented to industry as their newest piece of red tape to wrap up in. iCanada believes it's time to take a new approach. In 2019, I had the privilege of working with iCanada on a proposal that would not only eliminate ineffective regulations, but propose a structure to ensure no new unnecessary regulations were implemented. The proposal is included in our written submission today. Our proposal is modeled after the USA's Border Interagency Executive Council, which was initiated under President Obama and continued under President Trump. Our proposed Canadian Interagency Border Council would be responsible for vetting all existing and proposed regulations that could impact Canada's border. The best part of this proposal is that the regulators would be forced to sit down and have meaningful conversations with the regulated stakeholders. Industry representatives must have a substantive role and voice at the Border Council table, with a structure that ensures the regulators can regulate. Impacted government departments would be forced to justify in writing why they choose to diverge from industry recommendations. The Border Council will radically improve Canada's competitiveness while reducing the regulatory cycle and budgetary outlays. Just like the employees of the uncomfortable VP, industry stakeholders not only have aligned goals with the government at the border, they also have the tools and the data to make them a reality. Through the Collaborative Border Council, Canada could improve our global competitiveness in an ever-shifting geopolitical world. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much. Mr. Greco, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, honorable members, it is a pleasure to appear before you on behalf of 400 chambers of commerce and boards of trade, and more than 200 businesses of all sizes from all sectors of the economy and from every part of the country. It will come as no surprise that regulatory burden continues to be a growing concern for Canadian business. The World Bank's Ease of Doing Business report rated Canada as 23rd in 2020, but we were 4th in the world as recently as 2006. A big part of this decline is we are now ranked 53rd for the burden of government regulation on business. Regulation is literally stifling our economy. It goes without saying that the right policy environment can help businesses succeed and generate long-term economic growth for the country. Making Canada an attractive destination for business investment that supports economic growth requires getting the fundamentals right. At a time when inflation is persistent, government and the private sector must look at new ways to make Canada more competitive. Governments in the past have attempted to regulate our industries into a more competitive frame, but this has had the opposite effect, as the costs of starting and growing a business have become a disincentive to investment. The regulatory burden is troublesome in several ways, but two stand out. First, we can't continue to move at a snail's pace. We need the government to be more ambitious. We need the government to accelerate modernization and ensure approvals and permitting can meet our public policy ambition. Second, the ongoing ability of companies to comply with complex regulations is increasing operating costs. It is consistently one of the biggest barriers to economic growth. According to the SME Regulatory Compliance Cost Report, the total regulatory compliance cost to small businesses was nearly $5 billion in 2011, which at the time was approximately $3,500 per business. That number has no doubt increased over the past decade, along with the regulatory burden overall. We cannot afford more private sector investment decisions to be sidelined because of the complex regulatory environment in Canada. Too often, we hear from our members about the investments they have on hold while they wait for direction from the government. Lack of clarity and speed on the new investment tax credits is a good example. While other jurisdictions such as the United States move quickly to create the conditions for investment, Canada is falling behind. Complying with the complex network of overlapping regulations with all levels of government is expensive and time-consuming. When combined with inefficient and unpredictable regulatory processes, this sets all businesses up for failure. While I commend the government for pushing a regulatory modernization agenda, we must move more boldly and urgently. In the time remaining, I would like to focus on 3 recommendations. First, the government must move to implement an economic and competitiveness mandate to federal regulators. Too often, regulators do not fully consider economic impacts on business when making decisions. Second, is regulatory alignment across domestic and international jurisdictions. When regulations are more consistent between jurisdictions, businesses are better able to trade within Canada and beyond. Quite simply, we should not require a free trade agreement within our own country. Unless the government actively works to improve collaboration and alignment to ensure businesses are not at a disadvantage, we will see less innovation, fewer choices, and higher prices. An example of this is when each province establishes its own framework for regulating pesticides or rules for the trucking of goods across jurisdictions. Finally, the government should pledge to provide regulatory certainty for businesses. Evidence-based regulations can protect the public interest and promote market success. And for companies looking to invest billions of dollars in developing new pipelines, new mines, and other large-scale infrastructure projects, this is a must-have. In closing, Canada needs smarter regulatory systems, better processes, and well-designed regulations to help minimize the cost of business and unlock economic growth while improving public health and safety outcomes. Sustained collaboration with all levels of government and our international partners will make it easier for businesses to do what they do best, produce. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We'll start our 6-minute rounds with Mrs. Kusi, please. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to all of our witnesses for being here today. I see a lot of friends on the witness stand here today, and so it's a pleasure to have all of you with me. I'm looking at a March 22nd, 2023 article, which indicates that small business had paid at that time a total of $22 billion, that's not an M, that's a B, in federal carbon tax. Now I'm looking at a February 20th, 24 article, which indicates that the federal government scaled back their carbon tax rebates for small business. And in fact, that the federal government owed small businesses $2.5 billion in promised carbon tax revenues, which as of this date and this article have not been returned to small business. Now, I recognize, Ms. Pullman, your organization estimates that small businesses contribute as much as 40% of the government's overall carbon price revenue, even though data from your organization indicates that 52% of small firms oppose carbon pricing, and that as a result of this carbon pricing, they're being forced to raise prices for consumers. And over 4 in 10, 45%, said it will increase pressure on them to freeze, cut salaries and wages, something that supposedly parties within this room would like to see maintained or improved. And over 40% say they will have to reduce investment in their businesses. Now, we know that this government likes to perpetuate the lie that the carbon tax is even carbon neutral, never mind that families are losing funds as a result of this carbon tax, as was evidenced by the testimony of the parliamentary budget officer who gave testimony to this committee to that effect. So, Ms. Pullman, would you agree that this is not true as well for small businesses in Canada, that they are in fact losing money with the carbon tax, and that in fact they are owed money by this federal government, and that these cuts to the carbon tax should not be implemented because of the $22 billion that's already been collected, the $2.5 billion that was promised back to them, which is yet to be received? Can you comment on that, please, Ms. Pullman?
Yes, certainly. I think we've been very vocal about the fact that the $2.5 billion that's been sitting with government since 2019 is owed back to small businesses, and it is only a fraction. That's based on about 8 or 9% of the total revenues coming in. And as you stated, our calculations are it's closer to 40% of the revenues that come from small businesses that make up carbon revenues in the provinces in which it exists. And we believe that they've just lowered the amount that they are going to provide to small businesses from 9 to 5% and giving it to other groups for a variety of reasons. So yeah, it's become a real drag for many small business owners right now who are feeling the pinch and not feeling that they're necessarily being considered when it comes to the carbon tax, though they pay a lot of it. So we're hoping to see some movement on that shortly.
Indeed. I think a real drag is an understatement. I'm very proud to come from a small business family, and I know the stress around the dinner table if the store has had a bad day, and I can't imagine the stress of the carbon tax and all these millions of Canadians. We know this government has not been a friend to small business. For example, the 2017 tax changes they made an attempt to implement. This is just another example of that. Mr. Rico, you said in your opening statement that according to the SME Regulatory Compliance Cost Report, the total regulatory compliance cost to small businesses was nearly $5 billion in 2011, which at the time was approximately $3,500 per business. Would you have any idea how much of this would have been carbon tax related?
I don't have any idea, Ms. Kusi, but what I can say about those compliance costs is that that's because there's different requirements and different processes in different jurisdictions, and the fact that a lot of our members who are SMEs that takes them over a year or two just to be able to get a permit, that creates a hindrance to be able to do business. And so from our perspective, like that ties into the fact that we're not getting things built done in Canada. And if we're not getting things built done in Canada, then we're not spurring economic growth. And from our standpoint, I think that requires what I tied into my earlier remarks is that we need ambition in order to drive economic growth. Ambition without action, from our perspective, leads to empty economic promises, and we won't reverse our investment trends. So if you look at we're the second worst in the OECD in terms of business investment. We're almost near the bottom in terms of research and development spending. That all adds into the fact that if we don't have a proper level playing field for businesses to succeed, we won't be able to reduce the cost of doing business and supporting innovation.
Mr. Greer, do you have any comments to add on behalf of manufacturers and exporters relative to the effect of the carbon tax on the people you represent, please?
I would just add that manufacturers are generally facing a very high cost, high pressure environment at the moment, and it's cumulative. So it is certainly tax, as we're discussing here today, regulatory burden, and all of the costs identified and maybe not captured in federal processes. There's certainly the issue of incentives for manufacturing investment and the pressures coming from the U.S. through the Inflation Reduction Act. Not to mention that inflation also impacts all of the inputs that manufacturers require to produce products. So it's a very challenging environment for manufacturers, and it's really all of those factors that are driving anxiety among the industrial sector.
Mr. Swats, anything to add as my time comes to a close in 15 seconds?
Thank you. I think the piece on the carbon tax is to ensure that Canadian companies have a competitive footing in a world, right, in a global economy. Not all jurisdictions have such a tax. How are Canadians being equally treated in a global economy? And that's really one of the big pieces around regulations that impact trade. How do we justify an internal regulation that makes us uncompetitive on the global stage?
Indeed. Testimony from families and small businesses, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kuzmirchuk, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank you all for being here today. And you just heard from one of the apostles of the do-nothing conservatives on climate change, but I wanted to provide you with a different perspective. I wanted to say thank you. I wanted to thank you, Mr. Greer, especially for being here today, representing the Canadian manufacturers and producers. My hometown in Windsor, there's a saying, if you want it built right, you built it in Windsor. We have a lot of manufacturers in our community. It's a huge part of our prosperity in our community, our economy. So I wanted to say thank you for your tremendous advocacy. You mentioned the investment tax credits, and I read the Manufacturing Canada's Futures report, and it highlighted the importance of the investment tax credits for helping manufacturers to transition to a zero-emission, clean economy. How important are the investment tax credits that are contained in our federal government's Bill C-59?
Well, thank you for the question. So, we, very quickly after the Inflation Reduction Act was unveiled in the U.S., began advocating strongly for Canada to take appropriate action so that investment in building the clean net zero economy doesn't all happen south of the border. And the evidence of the impacts of the IRA are starting to show themselves. I think factory construction starts are up 70-some% year over year in the United States. So they are attracting a lot of investment. We were pleased to see the investment tax credit decisions that were announced through Budget 2023. And really now we're focusing and hoping the government focuses its efforts on accelerating the implementation of them. We have some timelines attached to them, but there's still a lot of guidance and implementation information that manufacturers don't have, which slows or in some cases delays investment decisions. So we're pleased to see the ITCs that have been proposed so far. We're now waiting for final guidance and implementation so that investment decisions can start being made.
And Mr. Greer, I hear you loud and clear. The ITCs are vital to manufacturing, to jobs and manufacturers. The Conservatives are holding up Bill C-59 at committee, delaying, obstructing, holding up this vital piece of legislation that contains the ITCs. Can you tell us what that delay and Conservative obstruction is costing and risking Canadian manufacturers?
So we've been long and will continue to urge swift implementation of all ITC-related measures, both legislative and in the guidance side. So The government just finished some consultations on a lot of the guidance for some of the ITCs, and that rests with ISED and other relevant departments in finance. So yes, we 100% encourage swift adoption of all legislative measures to implement the ITCs, but equally we're also very concerned that the guidance and implementation information that's needed so that investments can start being made have not been made public yet.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Greer. Ms. Pullman, I want to reassure you that our government remains absolutely committed to the carbon rebate program for small businesses that will return over billions of dollars to small businesses. So I wanted to reassure you and the members, we are absolutely committed to supporting small businesses and returning that funding to small businesses. The Library of Parliament provided a report that listed the one-for-one rule implementation over the last 11 years, both under the Conservative government, under the Liberal government. The top 4 years for reducing regulations, the top 4 years in the last 11 years happened under this Liberal government. We know that there's more work to be done. I wanted to ask you if there's one set of regulations or one sector that you would focus on, what would it be? And this is a question not just for you, Ms. Pullman, but also for all folks around the table as well, too. Is there a particular regulation or a particular sector that you would focus on?
Well, it's a tough question to answer because, frankly, if you start to pick who gets targeted, and I know there's been some of that work done already, and it's been interesting work. For example, transportation or whatever has been targeted to go through some regulatory modernization initiatives. The problem is that it hits every business, and there needs to be, I think that's a good idea to sort of focus on those areas that are very specifically, but you also have to focus on the big picture. And I think sometimes the big picture, it's depending on this sort of one act from 2015 that hasn't really moved or changed much, and I think it's a bit narrow and it needs to be broadened out. So, for example, the one-for-one rule that currently exists and I think is still implemented and still being used really just focuses on regulations. Yet increasingly rules that affect businesses and citizens come in legislation, policies, and guidelines. And that's not included. So we don't know, frankly, how many rules are actually out there. Anything that requires a business or an individual to do something needs to be incorporated and thought about as part of the overall picture of how do we get a handle on what those rules are in Canada.
Appreciate that. Mr. Greer, Mr. Swans, would you like to jump in on, is there a particular regulation that you hear from your members all the time? It just comes up all the time. Is there an example that you can share with us? Because that would help us understand better some of the regulations and the impact. So I want to go from the 30,000 altitude level to sort of the grassroots. Just curious.
We'll have time just for one of you to respond, please.
Sure. Very quickly. One, I just want to quickly echo Corinne in that while it is important to focus on the specific, it's akin to managing the symptoms of an underlying problem without treating the underlying problem. If you're looking for the most recent and current example, S211, the Child and Forced Labor Private Members legislation, while I think all of the organizations represented on this panel strongly support the objectives of that bill, there was zero consultation on the guidance that was issued from Public Safety just before Christmas. It imposes significant burden and compliance requirements on medium, large, and some small manufacturers and many other members in other sectors. That's created a lot of cost, anxiety, and expense at this moment right now in the lead up to the first reports that are due to be filed on this at the end of May.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Vignola, thank you for the red tape-free donuts you brought for the committee. You have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, lady, thank you so much for being here today. I'll give you the time to put your earpieces on. The regulatory framework and its burden is a subject that is particularly heavy for small businesses. For large businesses, we hear, oh, well, okay, it's okay, we've already paid for that, and so we can get through this. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Greer. Do you feel the same way as major businesses seem to do? They can get on with business as it is.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think the premise of your question is correct in that small and medium-sized businesses, certainly small and medium-sized manufacturers, are the ones that are hit hardest by regulation, especially regulation that is poorly designed or not put with an SME in mind. But it's not just the individual regulations, it's that nobody seems to be thinking about the cumulative burden facing that particular business. Nobody, you know, when a cost-benefit analysis comes in and says, well, we think the cost will only be this many $1,000 and this many extra hours a month of time to comply, that's not taking into account the thousands of other dollars of cost and dozens of other hours that are being spent often by one or two employees to focus on that. So without a doubt, we agree that the impact is largest on small and medium-sized businesses and is a big proportion of what's driving some of the productivity challenges and helping those businesses grow from small to medium or medium to large.
Merci. Merci.
Thank you very much for being so specific. Mr. Greer, you said that you hope that regulations would be more uniform from one province to another, and that would facilitate businesses doing business in various locations. I'm not in disagreement, but I'm not in total agreement either, because there is the issue of the jurisdictions that enters into the picture. When you go from province to province, you can't cherry pick either. Jurisdictions may vary. Nobody would say, even in a free trade agreement that has its own regulations, that they would all be respected. How would you succeed in finding an environment where you could respect the jurisdictions of various provinces, and yet there could be trade between those provinces?
Well, thank you for the question. So on the topic of mutual recognition, absolutely we believe that there is an opportunity, and there is no reason in many or most cases that there should be different rules, compliance regulations, and certifications for every province and territory. Especially a lot of these are small, minor issues. So some of the more famous examples are different first aid kit regulations. What should be in a first aid kit in a workplace? Fall protection. What type of protection should workers who are at elevations have to be required to wear? There's nothing different from falling down a ladder in Alberta as there is in Quebec or on the East Coast. There are lots of areas where they're just very small, very minor technical differences that cause a lot of irritation for businesses. You know, if there was political will, and really it would take leadership from all the premiers. This is provincial jurisdiction, save for some federal regulations. It would really require an approach that, one, there be buy-in, and that premiers and senior ministers would want to pursue this. But two, there would of course have to be carve-outs for provincial specific circumstances. So there are certainly differences for doing certain things in Alberta, in the mountains, that don't exist in other provinces where you may have to adjust safety or regulatory requirement standards. Certainly there would be language requirements and other issues for a province like Quebec. But for the most part, most of these aren't needed and cause significant cost and would have significant benefit if we were able to mutually recognize.
Si je comprends bien votre point.
If I understand what you're saying, leadership should not necessarily come from the federal level, that the regulatory framework of each province belongs to that province, each province. So the premier of each province then would be involved in, say, a Canada-wide meeting, a pan-Canadian meeting, where they would discuss this and represent their province.
I mean, absolutely. So there are separate federal regulations, and that's a lot of what we're talking about today, but so much of the burden that also our members face is at the provincial and at the municipal level. So it does require a significant amount of provincial leadership. But the benefits of doing so would be enormous. Trevor Tombe, the economist, has done some really excellent work on what the benefits of mutual recognition would be. and he found that it could increase our economy by 4.4 to 7.9% over the long term. That's like $100 to $200 billion a year. Per capita, we're talking $3,000 to $5,000 per person. It would be a significant economic boost if we were able to eliminate these interprovincial regulatory differences.
Great. Mr. Bachrach, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. This is an interesting discussion, and I think everyone around the table can think of examples of government regulations that seem overly onerous. And at the same time, we know that one of the goals of regulation is to protect things like health and safety and the environment and all these things that we value as society. There are plenty of examples of businesses advocating for deregulation that have led to really terrible outcomes. And we have situations, I've been the transport critic for 5 years, and, looking at the rail sector and what's happened in the rail sector around after Lac-Mégantic, after the derailments in Saskatchewan, you saw more regulation because, frankly, the trend that we had seen in that sector with huge lobbying from the big rail corporations was deregulation and self-regulation. And the Auditor General clearly found that those systems were not working. And so you see the pendulum kind of swinging back and forth, right? Another example from the air sector with Boeing, right? Canada's system for certifying aircraft, largely, very efficient system, largely rubber stamped the work of the Americans. Super efficient, probably saved businesses a lot of money, but it turned out that we were rubber stamping a system that was essentially corrupt and cost the lives of hundreds of people. In British Columbia, we had an experience with something called the Results-Based Forest Practices Code, which was an attempt at moving towards outcome-based forest management. So it's like, we're not going to tell you how close to log to the streams or, which trees to cut and which ones not to or how to build roads. It's like, as long as you broadly achieve these objectives that we're going to articulate in the legislation, you're good to go. Well, it turns out there were a bunch of problems with that because people weren't really checking what the outcomes were. Some of the outcomes were really bad, and there was a total lack of transparency for the public. So they couldn't even tell where the logging companies planned to log because they were no longer required to publish the maps. In the marine sector, we had a tugboat sink near Prince Rupert and kill 2 men a couple of years ago. Turned out that tugboat had never been inspected for safety. The life vests or the survival suits on board the tugboat had never been maintained. The zippers had never been lubricated. So these young men who are in a winter storm couldn't put the survival suits on. They couldn't do up the zippers. And so when they hit the water, they were dead. One of them managed to swim to a life raft and get to shore. So I guess, but 2 men lost their lives, right? And now we're pushing for more regulation in the small tugboat. It turns out that small tugboats under 15 tons don't have to be inspected, right? That's an efficient regulation if you're a small tugboat operator, but it sure isn't very efficient if you're a crew member. One of the crew members, he was a young guy. It was his first voyage on that tugboat. So I guess what I'm getting at is I think everyone around the table supports this idea of creating more efficient regulations, and there are regulations that are written really well, really smartly, that achieve the objective with the least burden to the folks who are trying to comply. And there are regulations that aren't so efficient. And the question is, how do we hit that sweet spot? But I guess I find that the one-to-one idea, it's a little bit simplistic in my mind because not every regulation is equally complex. And so a government could comply by, cutting a simple regulation and putting in place a new regulation that's 400 pages long that makes, So I don't know how we get at this, and I'm not an expert in it, but it just seems like we need to get away from the idea of simply slogans and catchphrases that are overly simplistic towards a real conversation about how do we create efficient policy that achieves the social objectives, the environmental objectives, and helps business operate and it helps our economy function. And that's the conversation that I want to have, and I hope that's the conversation that we can have as part of this study. Now, my question, because I think I'm supposed to end with a question. Is that right, Mr. Chair? How many more minutes do we
Why
have?
start now? To a minute and a half. Or
Minute and a
so.
half. Well, I do find this question around interprovincial trade barriers is an interesting one because to so many people it seems like not a no-brainer. Yet at the same time, we're a federation, and we see all sorts of challenges when it comes to operating as a single country. Not the least of which I don't even need to name because everyone knows exactly what we're talking about, right? And so how do we get there? What leadership is required from the federal government, because this is a federal committee, in order to have the provinces have a serious chat about how we eliminate these barriers?
Start. I think, frankly, I think the federal government and the provincial governments need to be able to talking to each other, because I think right now there's that lack of coordination, and we're seeing that between Health Canada, Environment, Climate Change Canada, other departments not talking to their provincial counterparts. And so when regulations are introduced at a provincial level or even at a federal level, sometimes it comes as a surprise. And I think so. We as an organization, we're for smart regulation, we're for outcomes-based regulation, but there has to be that regulatory cooperation between provinces, because if there isn't, we won't get the goods to market that we need. We won't have that smart regulation that is required. And so it has to be a holistic, a whole of government approach from our perspective.
I'd like to make a couple of comments. On the interprovincial
in about 30 seconds, please.
On the interprovincial trade side, we've done a huge amount of work, and we work closely with the federal government and all the provincial governments on trying to improve this process. The federal government can play a role of encouraging and bringing together all the provinces and playing a bit of a facilitator role, but they can't fix it. It is the provinces who have to fix it. Having said that, there are rules that the federal government are imposing on the provinces that also creates barriers, and they need to set an example to the provinces and say, okay, we're going to remove some of these or make them easier or make them better so that you guys do the same. And I think that that's how it's going to sort of start to move better. The federal government has actually done not a bad work in this area, and the interprovincial trade, I think they're actually really keen on moving forward. It's the provinces that are the ones we really need to focus on.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Mrs. Block, please go ahead.
Through you, Chair, I will be directing the first of my questions to Ms. Pullman, and then perhaps I will be able to have other witnesses weigh in on some of the issues that we're talking about here today. I did have the opportunity to meet with representatives from the CFIB earlier this spring. I have 360 members in my riding. I represent a large rural riding in Saskatchewan. And I did go back and look at the slide deck that they gave me, and I note that probably reflective of a poll that was conducted in January, 71% of your members highlighted that taxes and regulatory costs were the largest cost to small and medium-sized businesses. And I think that's something that we really need to pay attention to. Obviously, over the past 8 years, we've seen a steep increase in the cost of living for Canadians. And we've heard from small businesses that they are not immune, that they too have been struggling due to the rising price of everything, which is partially, we know, maybe in many ways being driven by the rising carbon tax. I do understand that the government stated that it gives back a portion of the carbon tax funds to small and medium-sized businesses. But as my colleague pointed out, I think your organization recently blew the whistle on the federal government, stating that they had failed to return what she identified as $2.5 billion of these funds to the businesses that you represent. And this includes $300 million to businesses in my province of Saskatchewan. Wow. And that is something that I think has been identified not only by your organization, perhaps even by members through their chambers of commerce, but certainly by businesses themselves through emails that I have received. And many have had to close their doors as a result of not only the pandemic, but then the rising costs that are being imposed on them. Can you tell me, if you're aware, has the government reached out to your organization or even to members of your organization in regards to returning these funds to small and medium-sized businesses?
Well, obviously, we've been actively engaged on this for quite a while. So we have been in touch with both the elected official side as well as the civil service side to sort of encourage ways to return that money, and certainly providing suggestions that has how that could be done. I think it's important to reiterate something that you said earlier as well, which is that corporate bankruptcies are up over 130% year over year in Canada. We see more businesses closing than opening. We've had that 3 months in a row, which is unheard of in Canada. They need this help right now. So anything we can do to get that money back to those businesses, I think will be very helpful. And I just want to make sure, and this has been our messaging, and we have been speaking to government, so there have been outreach. We have had those conversations. But we also want to make sure that any of that money that gets returned is not returned to just a distinct group of businesses or even larger businesses, that it's kind of given back to almost as many businesses as possible, because all of them have had to pay. And so I think it's important that that is a key component of whatever happens. We're very hopeful, but we have to just wait and see. And we're continuing to, of course, use our members and their influence to also encourage governments to return that money in those 8 provinces that are affected.
Thank you very much. The $300 million that is owed to Saskatchewan businesses works out to about $7,000 for each small business. What sort of, if you don't mind speculating, what sort of difference would this make to these businesses, particularly when the operating costs are so high due to many of, I would say, this government's disastrous policies? Have businesses come to you and articulated what difference getting this money back would make for them?
I think having a few $1,000s may not seem like much to a lot of people, but to a very small business, that can really help them get through the next 2 or 3 weeks. So it's going to be an important amount. Keep in mind, the CEBA deadline just passed, or the Canada Emergency Business Account deadline just passed, and we know that about 25% of them had to get a loan in order to repay it, and that another 6-8% couldn't pay it back. So they're also dealing with that. So having a little bit of money to help them pay with the debt that many of them are under is going to be really important. And I'm personally very worried about the fact that so many businesses are making decisions right now to close their business. So any little bit at this point is going to help. So we're really trying to encourage that money to be returned as soon as possible.
Thanks very much. Mr. Baines, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our guests for joining us today. And maybe I'll continue with the Federation of Independent Business. I had the chance to meet one of your colleagues yesterday and spoke about, openly about many challenges, barriers, and I know regulatory reform and red tape is, of course, top of mind for us as well. But there's other questions around labor and interprovincial labor and how those things work, and what are some of the barriers around that? Like I meet businesses all the time, and everyone says there's still a shortage of skilled labor. I know that we've increased economic immigration categories, and there's been a significant amount of work that's being done there. But then there's an impact with the credential recognition where there's been investment made. Maybe if you can sort of share how, goods getting to service, crossing provincial lines, and actual people who have the skills crossing provincial lines, what are the barriers there?
There's lots of barriers when it comes to that, especially when it comes to the more professional levels. Interprovincially, it can be very challenging for, say, a dental hygienist to move from one province to the next and quickly be able to work. Those are some of the challenges that we face within Canada. And of course, the shortage of labor overall continues to be a big factor for many businesses. We've seen the vacancy rates come down over the last, I'd say, 6 months, but they're still higher than they were pre-pandemic. So there's still lots of jobs wanting at the moment. And so a few of the things that have been done recently, for example, eliminating the cap on the number of hours international students can work, it was actually super helpful. A lot of small businesses were able to now hire people quickly into positions in restaurants and in the service sector, for example, and that's been really, really helpful. The cap, I think, we'll see how that impacts them, but it's more important the fact that they'll be able to work, that the ones that are here. So I think that, on the immigration side, there has been some good work done. We're a little worried about what the tightening of the temporary foreign worker program is going to look like and what it's going to mean. We understand that that is something that may be coming. And that will impact certain sectors of the economy that are still looking for that as a ways to find the people they need to fill the jobs they have.
Yeah, and again, that does lead into, again, regulation, the possible exploitation of these workers. We saw some of that with the international students, and that's why the measure was taken, and we need them to be studying. So I wanted to talk, if you could just sort of elaborate on how we can tackle some of the changes or some of the challenges with, say, the governing bodies who ultimately, certify and allow for certain people to get the credentials. And if you've done any work there.
It's a big challenge because if you talk to the provincial government side of the equation, they will tell you that they have fixed labor mobility, that labor mobility is not an issue. But when you talk to the individuals who are affected by it, because the colleges that exist in each province do have restrictions, it's still a big challenge in many areas of the country. And I don't know what the answer is there. I would think that these particular colleges would have some provincial oversight of them, and that maybe the provinces could do more to encourage them to be a bit more loose in how they sort of dictate who can work and who cannot in those particular professions. But that's probably where the biggest challenge rests right now on interprovincial mobility of labor in Canada.
Thank you. And I'm just going to shift to Mr. Swan so I have some time there. I wanted to get into the climate events that have happened, especially in my home province of British Columbia. We saw a major impact on imports and exports, of course, with the atmospheric rivers. Nothing we've seen ever before there. It wiped out a section of the Coquihalla Highway, which is a major supply corridor to the Okanagan and distribution center throughout from there. And of course, the port, $1 billion per day. And it's the largest port in Canada. It's if you can maybe talk about, what needs to be done there with the climate events that impact us and how we need to keep moving forward on
in about
fighting
30
that.
seconds.
Oh, but we could spend 3 days.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dan.
No. Yeah, exactly. It was actually a really good example of regulatory cooperation, what happened during the mudslides in BC. In order to move goods from the port to the rest of the country, a lot of the freight had to be rerouted through the U.S. Canada, my colleague who's joining us virtually, were actually instrumental in the coordination between CBSA and U.S. CBP or U.S. Customs to allow certain products to move through the U.S. on a temporary bond. We're getting into the weeds, but the reality is if you don't have regulators who have relationships with industry, you're never going to enable these sorts of emergency measures to take place. That's why it is so very important that the government sit down regularly with industry so that there's already a foundational relationship.
Thank you very much.
And if I could just add...
No, I'm afraid we're actually about a minute past our time, sir, but perhaps on the next round. Ms. Vignola, please, for 2.5.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. In the one-for-one rule regulation, and I will go here with Ms. Corinne Ponan, because it does deal with small business more than anything else. We have this one-for-one rule somewhere, and it's the somewhere that brings me to ask questions. This is not a trick. I just really want to hear your opinion on this. If you add regulation in a sector, but you have to take one away elsewhere, what happens for the business that is affected by the new regulation? Am I wrong in thinking that if you add a new regulation and if you take away the other regulation elsewhere, and of course it has to be on a logical basis, it has to be beneficial to that very business that had a regulation added to it, if you understand what I'm trying to tell you. Am I correct in my thinking? In terms of the 1-for-1 rule, you take one away, but you add another.
So the idea behind the 1-for-1 rule is that at the federal level, what they do is that they have something called the standard cost model. And so for every regulation that is introduced, they try to eliminate one that has a similar cost or burden on businesses. The reason why this is important is that we don't do a very good job in Canada of getting rid of regulations that are no longer necessary, may be redundant, may no longer really work. And it's a way to kind of keep the folks that create the regulations looking at the whole pile of them and figuring out which ones are still important, which ones do we keep, which ones are maybe less important that we should get rid of that have sort of a burden. Maybe it's, we can move in a different direction, maybe. So that's the idea. It's not that you have to be strict about it, but it's about getting the people who create the regulations to think differently about regulations, not just creating them and creating them and creating them, but managing them, thinking a little bit more about, do we really need a regulation? Can we manage this through some other means? Can this regulation that's been sitting here for 30 years but nobody really ever looks at anymore, is it really still necessary? That's what we don't do well in Canada. So this is just a means of putting those constraints on the regulators and forcing them to think a little bit more about the overall picture of the regulatory burden on businesses. Because every department, every regulation on its own, you can argue is important. But nobody thinks about the whole burden and the whole of it and what impact that has on what people are going to do. The fact that almost two-thirds of small business owners...
I have to interrupt you there. I apologize because
Okay.
we're quite a bit past our time. Colleagues, we've been going past time, and everyone, I'm sure if you're watching, please just keep your questions real short. I've been letting it go along because the answers are fascinating. I think are very important, but if we could shorten up our questions. I know. Well, yes. Yes. Not yours, Mr. Bachrach. Yours is right on. But if we can just keep it short so we can have more time. Mr. Bachrach, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. I will try to keep this short. One of my colleagues down the way asked a question about carbon pricing earlier, and I think this is a very topical and interesting question because Canada is signatory to the Paris Agreement, which requires us to do very specific things. And so I'm curious if your organizations, first of all, support upholding our international commitment vis-a-vis Paris. And secondly, if you do support it, which I would hope you would, how you would see the government better approach the question of how we drive down emissions and meet those reductions. There's only a few ways you can get there. You can get there through pricing, you can get there through regulations, and you can get there through incentives. I'm guessing, based on your comments about the ITCs, the tax credits, that you prefer incentives, but all the modeling I've seen is that it's one of the most expensive ways to drive down emissions on a per ton basis. The United States has invested very heavily in that, but they're also running massive deficits. So what's the right mix when it comes to pricing, regulations, and incentives, in your view, to meet the Paris Accord?
Thank you. Well, Mr. Chair, I'll just jump in. I mean, incentives certainly may be more costly on a per ton basis for a calculation, but the question we're really getting at is, where do we want to build the clean economy of the future? Do we want it to be built in the United States or south of the border, or do we want to be doing it in Canada and exporting it to the rest of the world where we can help them also reduce their emissions? So we see incentives as a critical part of that. That doesn't mean that there's not a mix of other tools that can help contribute to it, but we certainly believe there's a chance to enable global emission reductions, but also create good, clean energy jobs for Canadians in this country. The Inflation Reduction Act has sharply changed that conversation for all the reasons that you've outlined, and so it is urgent that the government sort of assess the current environment that we're in, understand how that's impacting investment. But I think germane to this discussion is it's not just incentive, it's not just investment, it's the regulatory environment in which we're asking companies to make these investments to lower burden. It is very expensive, costly, and time-consuming to introduce a new product, service, or modernize a process when you've got so many regulatory hoops to jump through. And so it's also regulating smarter in a way that allows us to enable those clean manufacturing innovations.
Sorry, thanks. Mrs. Cusi, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Unfortunately, a portion of the public service is in the unfortunate position again. We saw a great failure with the public service negotiations maybe 18 months ago, leading to actually strikes and protests outside this very house. We have now again a CBSA strike vote in the next month due to a lack of a contract within the CBSA for 2 years. So I'd like to ask you, Mr. Swants, please, is the strike vote causing uncertainty for importers and exporters?
Yes, it is. And I think the biggest uncertainty is around the timing. The strike may occur at the same time as the CBSA is starting to implement a major new software program called CARM, or the CBSA's Assessment and Revenue Management Software Program. This program has been subject to a number of hearings at the CIIT committee, and there was a motion tabled yesterday at that committee around this. A strike could be quite concerning if it happened at the same time, because we're unsure what the result of that software will be because it's frankly untested.
Thank you. Mr. Greer, would you like to add anything to that, please, on behalf of manufacturers and exporters?
No, just to echo, the timing is of concern to us and our members for the same reasons that Mr. Swan outlined.
Thank you. Ms. Pullman, I see on your website you are encouraging the government to pass private members bill, Bill C-234 in an effort to provide further carbon tax relief for Canadians. Could you speak a little bit about that, please, about your organization's encouragement of the passing of Bill C-234? Thank you.
Sure. C-234 is the bill that will reduce carbon pricing for certain types of farm activities. And there is already a reduction in carbon pricing for farms in certain capacities, but this is to touch on some of the other elements that the farm uses energy for that weren't a part of the exemption on the carbon pricing in the first place, such as heating barns and other such types of activities. And we have had anecdotal information from some of our ag members that they've seen their carbon pricing go up quite dramatically, having a huge impact on things like how they can operate their business and how they sell their goods. So we're hoping that C-234 in its original form will be able to go through, but we know that there are amendments already being placed on it, which is dampening down what was the original piece. We would love to see the original version pass through the House.
Right, in its original form. Thank you very much for adding that. And finally, Mr. Rico, I'm sure you, as many Canadians, have been following the Arrive scam scandal, the issue which has seized not only this committee, but Parliament and also Canadians. Can you tell us about the discussion about the way that this shows government to conduct business? Is there any discussion, feedback, conversation within your membership as to this scandal, and what would be their reaction and their commentary regarding it if business were to be done in a way that we have seen the Arrive scandal unfold?
Well, I think overall, for business to be done properly, just broadly speaking, it has to be done openly and transparently. And I think when you're looking at procurement processes, there has to be able to be clear guidelines in general. And I think right now, if departments don't talk to each other, if there's not an ability for that transparency to happen, then it makes it difficult to do business. I think every business has a budget. Everybody has to follow guidelines. Everybody has to be able to follow rules. And if you're overspent, it's also a challenge as well, right? So there has to be a balanced approach overall from our perspective. And as long, I think when it comes tying back to regulatory reform, if we're transparent, if we're coordinated and we're aligned, then I think it can lead to better outcomes, not only for businesses, but also for Canadians as well.
In your opinion, does the current Canadian procurement system serve Canadian businesses?
There's procurement reform is required. I think from our perspective, I think if we look at what we tie into even advanced research and commercialization and innovation projects, if we look what has been done in the United States with the U.S. DARPA agency, I think they've been the model in terms of what happens with procurement. I think that ties into the fact that there needs to be fair and open procurement practices, and that's something we've called for at the chamber. I think there's a long way to go. I think that has to tie into be able to encourage more domestic manufacturing, especially when we're competing with our largest trading partners, but also to ensure that we're producing the best goods and services possible for Canadians.
Thank you, witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks very much, Mrs. Kusi. Mr. Souza, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the four of you for being here. Increasing our competitiveness, reducing the cumulative burden of regulatory issues to ensure that we were able to lower some of the provincial barriers as well as international trade and supplement some of that growth. I mean, regardless of the partisan rhetoric that happens at times in these discussions, we're all in favor of trying to make our businesses more competitive and ensuring that we grow our economy and that we're productive. Those are critical issues. Without that, we can't sustain all the other things that are important to our services and government and to the people of Canada. So there's two issues that I want to get into with you. One is around, in my previous life, I tried to bring forward a capital market securities regulator for all of Canada. We had 8 provinces signed on to the deal, made us more competitive, lowered duplication of services, reduce regulatory matters, enabled us to be more competitive in the national stage. But politics, right? And so suddenly it falls apart with every different election. And that's a real challenge in the Federation. I think Mr. Bacharach even alluded to that as well. So we have to be mindful that when you're talking to federal government, we're also talking to all the other governments that are part of this equation. So how do you feel about independent regulators? I'm talking about the Ontario Securities Commission, for example. I'm talking about FSRA, the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario, which we changed from it was too close to government. We put it arm's length to provide independence and to minimize government interference. Give me your thoughts. Bank of Canada is an example of that.
I mean, I'll jump in very quickly. Some of the independent regulators you referenced aren't necessarily as relevant to our members in the manufacturing sector, but in general, I think you've at the front end identified a really important point, which is it's all the different jurisdictions, and we're talking about dozens of regulators across each jurisdiction, all of whom think they're doing an excellent job and are beyond reproach. And for every individual regulator, even the independent ones, in some cases, I think there can be some usefulness and helpfulness to that. But in other cases, that independence also can sometimes become a barrier to the right kind of political leadership that can help ask for greater consideration of economic impacts.
So if I may step in, I know CFIB will want to talk about this because the majority of the small businesses are affected by some of these issues on other matters, like safety codes, like labor codes. I mean, there are people dying through some of their labor arrangements not far, like 10 years ago. We had to change laws and regulatory authorities because of it. Transportation regulations had to change because of rail derailments. So how do you balance the degree of changes that we're making? This one-to-one thing doesn't work because there are matters that are rarely relevant that have to be dealt with almost immediately, but the cumulative effect is impactful. So which regulations do you want us to reduce? Like, tell me what it is that we can eliminate to be competitive.
Well, I mean, again, I can give you a list of a dozen or more regulations right now that we think are going to have a big burden on small businesses that have been introduced within the last few years. They could be forms, they could be all kinds of different. So I can do that. And I mentioned a few in my opening remarks, right? But I also think it's important to realize that it needs to be more than that. It needs to be, I mean, I look at some of the provinces, right? British Columbia, for example, has done an excellent job of maintaining a cap on their regulations for almost 20 years now. In fact, the NDP government there just announced yesterday they're going to extend it for another year. So they are continuing to do this over a 20-year period and keeping a cap. They put it in their budgets every year. These are all the departments. These are all the regulations. These have gone up. These have gone down. And that kind of thing still needs to be done.
Yeah, and I'll come to you in a sec. So the provincial regulators, the province of Ontario, we've been trying to do that too as well in terms of trying to minimize, but suddenly it keeps growing. Even still, it grows. And so, and one of them is around carbon pricing. So we've identified that we live in a world environment where we're all going to be subject to pricing. The federal pricing system is a backstop. It's not the rule of law. It's the backstop. So each province can do what they want to try to be competitive in the pricing. Ontario had a cap and trade system where dollar for dollar, $1.5 billion was reinvested into businesses, into small businesses, into rentals and deals. So what is your thoughts for the political interference that they wanted to pick a fight with the federal government when they had a system that exempted them from having it? CFIB, tell me, how do you feel about that?
I'm afraid you only have about 12 seconds. Mr. Souza, is it fair if we just ask him to reply in writing to this?
Oh, no, just say yay. Oh, come on,
Well,
very quickly.
perhaps
Give me some latitude.
Perhaps I can answer. Well, I'm adding latitude to Ms. Atwin's next intervention, so maybe
It'll come up
picking
in the next
there.
round.
Yeah, please. Thanks. We're going to come to our final interventions because we've got a couple extra minutes. We'll do instead of 5, 5, 2.5, 2.5. We'll do 6, 6, 3.5, 3.5. And I've got Mrs. Kusi, please.
I'll pass my time to Mrs. Block, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I will be splitting my time with my colleague, Mr. Genuous. We were speaking about the one-for-one rule earlier in the Red Tape Reduction Act, and I guess I have a couple of questions for any one of you that would like to answer it. In your experience, have you found that the government generally abides by this rule? We'll start with Mr. Greer.
Sure. The short answer is by the letter of the rule and the law, yes. It does require a cost analysis, the standard cost model that Ms. Pullman referenced earlier, and then over a 2-year period, you have to reconcile costs in and costs out. So how it's written, yes, but how it's written is too narrow. There are all sorts of legislative changes, guidance, and other rules that the rule doesn't apply to. So you can still abide by the one-for-one rule, which the government is, and still have a significant increase in regulatory burden. And I think I said off the top, the administrative burden baseline, the number of regulations that impose a burden on businesses has increased from 130,000 in 2014 to 149,000 as of 2022. So we're still seeing, despite that rule, a growth in administrative burden requirements.
Thank you very much. I was going to ask, and perhaps you've already answered it, but maybe I'll just see if I've understood you correctly. So do you know of any jurisdictions that have had successful regulatory modernization initiatives, and perhaps what lessons or best practices from those jurisdictions we could adopt? A really quick answer.
Ms. Pullman referenced British Columbia. They actually set out to reduce the overall burdens on business and then maintain it. So I think that would be a worthy goal at the federal level, to reduce and maintain.
Thank you very much. I'll now turn my time over to Mr. Genuous.
Thank you, Chair. I found the testimony very interesting today. Thank you all for being here. I do have a motion that I want to move. It's on notice regarding Indigenous procurement, though, and I hope we'll be able to come to some kind of a consensus on that quickly. So that it is the motion I put on notice regarding the creation of a subcommittee to study the issue of Indigenous procurement. Members had it and are familiar with it and can look at it. For those that were not following us on Monday, just to quickly review, this is a motion that would involve us doing a study through a subcommittee on Indigenous procurement, specifically on government operations and Indigenous reconciliation, looking at some of the issues and potential problems with the Indigenous procurement system. I'd like to make a few comments first on substance and then on process. First of all, Indigenous procurement is extremely important to us, and I hope to all parliamentarians, creating jobs and opportunity, supporting the development of Indigenous businesses, and ensuring that Indigenous communities across this country benefit is something that's very valuable and very important. Through our study of Arrive Can, we've seen that there have clearly been what appear to be abuses. That is, companies that are tiny companies that are not seeking to provide benefit to Indigenous peoples in a broader way are simply receiving contracts and then subcontracting to non-Indigenous businesses. I believe that this is contrary to the purpose of the program, and that getting to the bottom of what happened, recommended changes, is an important way to seek to restore credibility and confidence in the process. This is an issue that is separate and distinct from the Arrive Can issue, although there's obviously a link, and I think it involves looking at both procurement issues and policies of Indigenous affairs. Why am I proposing a subcommittee? I see this as being a policy area kind of at the nexus of what would be INAN's mandate and what would be OGO's mandate. I know that both committees are very busy. There are other studies that members have wanted to do at this committee, and INAN frequently receives government legislation. Both committees are very busy. I think a subcommittee that brings together people with specific expertise in both of those areas would be the most effective way of doing it. It could be time limited in its operations, but I think it's important. We don't want to crowd out other priorities. We want to make sure there's a forum that can get this done. I do want to work towards having a motion that can succeed on this. Very much open to amendments. I understand Ms. Vignola may have an amendment that I'm very much disposed to. I hope we can have a conversation that leads to us being able to undertake this work in a collaborative way. It's important work. We want to be able to restore confidence in the Indigenous contracting system and ensure that we have a procurement system that is delivering real benefit to Indigenous peoples across Canada and is not being hijacked by well-connected insiders who know how to work the system but are not providing those real benefits. That's why I put forward this motion today, Chair, and I'm very open to some amendments. I expect we'll see some, and we'll have a good discussion about those. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jennis. Does everyone have a copy? It has gone out before. Mrs. Block, you had your hand up. Before I do that, colleagues, I'm thinking maybe because I'm hoping to get to in camera so we can discuss the translation issue that we sent out, but I'm thinking of releasing the witnesses. I've been getting some feedback from everyone that these have been phenomenal witnesses, and perhaps we'd probably enjoy an opportunity to have them back in. So thank you very much for being with us today. I wish we could have gotten through the last rounds, but I suspect that we will have you back so we can have shorter questions and longer answers. But thank you for joining us. I sincerely appreciate all of you making the effort to be here in person as well. You are dismissed, and we will get to, I think, Mrs. Block. But thanks, and we'll look forward to having you back before summer. Mrs. Block, do we need to? Sure, we're just going to suspend for a couple moments. Mrs. Block has withdrawn her name, sorry, but I see Mrs. Vignola has her hand up, and then I have Ms. Atwin.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor. We all think it's important to be sure that the policies put in place to provide greater diversity in supply and procurement, all of that is important. I'm speaking for myself, but I think that generally speaking, that would be the feeling of all parties around the table. We all feel that when we give a contract on DEI, we want to attain these objectives, and consequently, we agree in general with Mr. Genuis's motion. It is an important subject. My amendment would allow us to make an analysis or to get into a greater, more detailed study of the documents that I would suggest, but it would be an analysis that would allow us to decide whether or not there is a problem that is generalized, that may well require a broader study in the long run, a more detailed study in the long run. So without beating my drum any further, here's my suggestion. What is lacking in Mr. Genuis's motion is just the basic ideas, but I don't like the formulation. I would say that pursuant to Standing Orders 108(2) and 3C of the Standing Orders, the committee would give a list to the Government of Canada of qualified Indigenous businesses in both official languages, and that would include each business under for Procurement Canada, for PSPC Canada, and also the value that each business represents, and also the specifics of the business. That information would be specified and received by May 2nd, 2024. In view of the fact that we're talking about policies involving Indigenous procurement, and according to the list, that would be created here, I think that we could add these elements. That the members of the committee would analyze the said list and would provide a follow-up to have a longitudinal study in committee at the committee's choice, but that be done before June 20, 2024. So step one, you get the list that would allow you to make a preliminary study. And if you come to the conclusion that there is, in fact, a generalized or systemic problem in terms of Indigenous procurement, you then would be able, by June 20th, to decide whether or not to add that specific subject to the committee's studies list, and that would be, as I say, at the decision of the members of the committee. Thank you.
Sending out Mrs. Vignola's amendment to everyone. Her amendment. Okay. Go ahead, please.
Great.
And then we have Mr. Genuis.
Well, I'm really grateful that we've come to this place. I think that the spirit of it, again, we want to get to the bottom of what's happening, and we want to support the policy around Indigenous business and set-asides and procurement strategies. But I was concerned about the broad scope. I really wanted to just take the time right now to comment on how I think problematic it is for a committee to look at and perhaps scrutinize the indigeneity of an individual and perhaps their workforce. There are certain mechanisms within different departments who can conduct these kinds of audits. Indigenous Services Canada is an example of that. I was just concerned again about the broad scope, and so I'm very much open to getting the data, looking at the information first, and then moving from there to determine where we want to take it. Should it require a further longitudinal study? Should it require a subcommittee? I think that we need more information to be able to decide that. And again, because there is a complex issue here around identity, which may become more problematic than we might first assume looking at the initial motion. And so I'm very much in support of Ms. Vignola's amendment.
Thank you. Mr. Genuis on the amendment, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think we're hopefully coming towards a consensus then. I think this is an important area to study, and if it gives members greater confidence in the process, requesting documents as an initial step is very reasonable, and then the committee can evaluate next steps after that. So I'm supportive of the amendment as well. I will just say the original motion and the amendment is about scrutinizing government policy. And that is our job as parliamentarians. It's to look at the government policy as it relates to Indigenous procurement. And I know, of course, that is going to touch on a variety of different important, complex issues. But at the end of the day, it's about looking at government policy and seeing if it's working or not, and making recommendations about how to improve it. So. But I won't belabor the point. I think we're at a consensus, Chair, so I think we can probably proceed to a vote on the amendment and the amended motion.
All right, we're fine with the. Do we need a recorded vote, or are we fine to do so on UC? Perfect. The amendment is adopted. We'll now vote on the amended or the motion as amended. You wish a recorded vote? Perfect. We will do so.
Ms. Atwin.
In favor.
Mr. Baines?
Oui.
Mr. Johari?
Yes.
Mr. Kuzmierczak?
Yes.
Well, that's your name.
Mr. Souza?
Yes.
He could barely get out a yes, so I'm not sure he knows.
Ms. Block?
Yes.
Mr. Jennings?
Yes.
Ms. Cousy?
Yes.
Madame Vignola?
Oui.
Mr. Backrack?
Yes.
Yes pour 10, and nays contre 0.
Excellent. So adopted. Thank you very much. Yep.
Yeah, Mr. Chair.
Kuzmierczak?
Yeah, just wanted to ask a question. If we can get an update from the clerk on what we had requested in terms of the correspondence between the premiers and the committee regarding their appearance, if we can get that update.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay, thank you. Well, we sent a follow-up to Mr. Higgs' office yesterday about the documentation that was requested originally, I think 2 weeks ago, by the committee. So we will see what fruit the committee will gather from it. And with regard to the question, when the clerk of the committee reached out to premiers for the appearance, as far as I know, the date was March 26. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
I can just ask, have they shared correspondence to that fact with the committee? Because I think we asked.
When you say they, who's they?
The premiers. We had asked them to share correspondence with the committee regarding their appearance.
I think that's what you were saying is we've requested it again.
Yes, yesterday.
Yeah, again.
Again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can we bring him to the bar?
Great. We are now going to go into camera because I just need to discuss the translation issue. Everyone's received the letter from the clerk, so we will go into camera. If you're not supposed to be here, please feel free to leave.